The Drunken Boat, the Revolutionary Element in Romanticism by Northrop Frye. Any such conception as Romanticism is at one or more removes from actual literary experience, in an inner world where 10,000 different things flash upon the inward eye with all the bliss of oversimplification. Some things about it, however, are generally accepted, and we may start with them. First, Romanticism has a historical center of gravity, which falls somewhere around the 1790 to 1830 period. This gets us at once out of the fallacy of timeless characterization, where we say that Romanticism has certain qualities not found in the age of Pope, of sympathy with nature or what not, only to have someone produce a poem of Propertius or Kalidasa or, eventually, Pope himself, and demand to know if the same qualities are not there. Second, Romanticism is not a general historical term like medieval. It appears to have another center of gravity in the creative arts. We speak most naturally of Romantic literature, painting, and music. We do, it is true, speak of Romantic philosophy, but what seems to us most clearly romantic in that are such things as the existential ethic of Fichte, or the analogical constructs of Schelling. Both of them, in different ways, examples of philosophy produced by an essentially literary mind, like the philosophies of Sartre or Maritain in our day. So at least they seemed to Kant, if one may judge from Kant's letter to Fichte, suggesting that Fichte abandoned philosophy as a subject too difficult for him, and confined himself to lively popularizations. Third, even in its application to the creative arts, Romanticism is a selective term, more selective even than Baroque appears to be becoming. We think of it as including Keats, but not, on the whole, Crabbe, Scott, but not, in general, Jane Austen, Wordsworth, but not, on any account, James Mill. As generally used, romantic is contrasted with two other terms, classical and realistic. Neither contrast seems satisfactory. We could hardly call Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads anti-realistic, or ignore the fact that Shelley was a better classical scholar than, say, Dryden, who, according to Samuel Johnson, translated the first book of the Iliad without knowing what was in the second. Still, the pairings exist, and we shall have to examine them. And yet, fourth, though selective, Romanticism is not a voluntary category. It does not see Byron as the successor to Pope, or Wordsworth as the successor to Milton, which would have been acceptable enough to both poets. It associates Byron and Wordsworth, to their mutual disgust, with each other. Accepting all this, we must also avoid the two traps in the phrase history of ideas. First, an idea as such is independent of time and can be argued about. An historical event is not and cannot be. If Romanticism is in part an historical event, as it clearly is, then to say with T.E. Holm, I object to even the best of the Romantics, is much like saying, I object to even the best battles of the Napoleonic War. Most general value judgments on Romanticism as a whole are rationalizations of an agreement or disagreement with some belief of which Romantic poetry is supposed to form the objective correlative. This latter is the second, or Hegelian trap in the history of ideas, which we fall into when we assume that around 1790 or earlier, some kind of thesis arose in history and embodied itself in the Romantic movement. Such an assumption leads us to examining all the cultural products we call romantic as allegories of that thesis. Theses have a way of disagreeing with each other, and if we try to think of Romanticism as some kind of single idea, all we can do with it is what Lovejoy did. Break it down into a number of contradictory ideas with nothing significant in common. In literature, and more particularly poetry, ideas are subordinated to imagery, to a language more simple, sensuous, and passionate than the language of philosophy. Hence, it may be possible for two poets to be related by common qualities of imagery, even when they do not agree on a single thesis in religion, politics, or the theory of art itself. The history of imagery, unlike the history of ideas, appears to be for the most part a domain where, in the words of a fictional Canadian poetess, the hand of man hath never trod. Yet we seem inexorably led to it by our own argument, and perhaps the defects in what follows may be in part excused by the novelty of the subject, to me at least. After making every allowance for a prodigious variety of technique and approach, it is still possible to see a consistent framework. I wish the English language had a better equivalent for the French word cadre in the imagery of both medieval and Renaissance poetry. The most remarkable and obvious feature of this framework is the division of being into four levels. The highest level is heaven, the place of the presence of God. Next come the two levels of the order of nature, the human level and the physical level. The order of human nature, or man's proper home, is represented by the story of the Garden of Eden in the Bible and the myth of the Golden Age in Boethius and elsewhere. Man is no longer in it, but the end of all his religious, moral, and social cultivation is to raise him into something resembling it. Physical nature, the world of animals and plants, is the world man is now in, but unlike the animals and plants, he is not adjusted to it. He is confronted from birth with a moral dialectic, and must either rise above it to his proper human home, or sink below it into the fourth level of sin, death, and hell. This last level is not part of the order of nature, but its existence is what at present corrupts nature. A very similar framework can be found in classical poetry, and the alliance of the two, in what is so often called Christian humanism, accounts for the sense of an antagonism between the Romantic movement and the classical tradition, in spite of its many and remarkable affinities with that tradition. Such a framework of images, however closely related in practice to belief, is not in itself a belief or an expression of belief. It is in itself simply a way of arranging images and providing for metaphors. At the same time, the word framework itself is a spatial metaphor, and any framework is likely to be projected in space, even confused or identified with its spatial projection. In Dante, Eden is a long way up, on top of the mountain of purgatory. Heaven is much further up, and hell is down, at the center of the earth. We may know that such conceptions as heaven and hell do not depend on spatial metaphors of up and down, but a cosmological poet, dealing with them as images, has to put them somewhere. To Dante, it was simple enough to put them at the top and bottom of the natural order, because he knew of no alternative to the Ptolemaic picture of the world. To Milton, who did know of an alternative, the problem was more complex, and Milton's heaven and hell are outside the cosmos, in a kind of absolute up and down. After Milton comes Newton, and after Newton, ups and downs become hopelessly confused. What I see first of all in Romanticism is the effect of a profound change, not primarily in belief, but in the spatial projection of reality. This in turn leads to a different localizing of the various levels of that reality. Such a change in the localizing of images is bound to be accompanied by, or even cause, changes in belief and attitude, and changes of this latter sort are exhibited by the Romantic poets. But the change itself is not in belief or attitude, and may be found in, or at least affecting, poets of a great variety of beliefs. In the earlier framework, the disorder of sin, death, and corruption was restricted to the sublunary world of four elements. Above the moon was all that was left of nature as God had originally planned it before the fall. The planets, with their angel-guided spheres, are images of a divinely sanctioned order of nature, which is also the true home of man. Hence, there was no poetic incongruity in Dante's locating his paradiso in the planetary spheres, nor in Milton's associating the music of the spheres with the song of the angels in the Nativity Ode, nor in using the same word heaven for both the kingdom of God and the sky. A post-Newtonian poet has to think of gravitation and the solar system. Newton, Miss Nicholson has reminded us, demanded the muse, but the appropriate muse was Urania, and Urania had already been requested by Milton to descend to a safer position on earth for the second half of Paradise Lost. Let us turn to Blake's poem, Europe, engraved in 1794. Europe surveys the history of the Western world from the birth of Christ to the beginning of the French Revolution, and in its opening lines parodies the Nativity Ode. For Blake, all the deities associated with the planets and the starry skies, of whom the chief is Enitharmon, the Queen of Heaven, are projections of a human will to tyranny, rationalized as eternal necessity and order. Christianity, according to this poem, had not abolished but confirmed the natural religion in the classical culture which had deified the star gods. The doom of tyranny is sealed by the French Revolution, and the angel who blows the last trumpet as the sign of the final awakening of liberty is Isaac Newton. The frontispiece of Europe is the famous vision of the sky god Arisen, generally called the Ancient of Days, holding a compass in his left hand. And this picture is closely related to Blake's portrait of Newton, similarly preoccupied with a compass and oblivious of the heavens he is supposed to be studying. Blake's view, in short, is that the universe of modern astronomy, as revealed in Newton, exhibits only a blind, mechanical, subhuman order. not the personal presence of a deity. Newton himself tended to think of God still as up there, even to the extent of suggesting that space was the divine sensorium. But what was up there, according to Blake, is only a set of interlocking geometrical diagrams, and God, Blake says, is not a mathematical diagram. Newtonism leads to what for Blake are intellectual errors, such as a sense of the superiority of abstractions to actual things, and the notion that the real world is a measurable but invisible world of primary qualities. But Blake's main point is that admiring the mechanisms of the sky leads to establishing human life in mechanical patterns too. In other words, Blake's myth of Arisen is a fuller and more sophisticated version of the myth of Frankenstein. Blake's evil, sinister, or merely complacent sky gods, Arisen, Nobodaddy, Enitharmon, Satan, remind us of similar beings in other romantics: Shelley's Jupiter, Byron's Arimanes, the Lord in the prologue to Faust. They, in their turn, beget later romantic gods and goddesses, such as Baudelaire's female Froide Majesté, Hardy's Imminent Will, or the god of Hausmann's The Chestnut Casts His Flambeau, who is a brute and blackguard because he is a sky god in control of the weather, and sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. The association of sinister or unconscious mechanism with what we now call outer space is a commonplace of popular literature today, which is a romantic inheritance. Perhaps Orwell's 1984, a vision of a mechanical tyranny informed by the shadow of a big brother who can never die, is the terminal point of a development of imagery that began with Blake's Ancient of Days. Not every poet naturally associates mechanism with the movements of the stars, as Blake does, or sees it as a human imitation of the wrong kind of divine creativity. But the contrast between the mechanical and the organic is deeply rooted in romantic thinking, and the tendency is to associate the mechanical with ordinary consciousness, as we see in the account of the associative fancy in Coleridge's Biographia, or of discursive thought in Shelley's Defense of Poetry. This is in striking contrast to the Cartesian tradition, where the mechanical is of course associated with the subconscious. The mechanical being characteristic of ordinary experience, it is found particularly in the world outside. The superior or organic world is consequently inside, and although it is still called superior or higher, the natural metaphorical direction of the inside world is downward, into the profounder depths of consciousness. If a romantic poet, therefore, wishes to write of God, he has more difficulty in finding a place to put him than Dante or even Milton had, and on the whole he prefers to do without a place, or finds within metaphors more reassuring than up-there metaphors. When Wordsworth speaks in The Prelude and elsewhere of feeling the presence of deity through a sense of interpenetration of the human mind and natural powers, one feels that his huge and mighty forms, like the spirits of Yeats, have come to bring him the right metaphors for his poetry. In the second book of the Excursion we have a remarkable vision of what has been called the heavenly city of the 18th century philosophers, cast in the form of an ascent up a mountain, where the city is seen at the top. The symbolism, I think, is modeled on the vision of Cleopolis in the first book of The Fairy Queen, and its technique is admirably controlled and precise. Yet surely this is not the real Wordsworth. The spirits have brought him the wrong metaphors that Spenser used with full imaginative conviction, but which affect only the surface of Wordsworth's mind. The second level of the older construct was the world of original human nature, now a lost paradise or golden age. It is conceived as a better and more appropriate home for man than his present environment, whether man can regain it or not. But in the older construct, this world was ordinarily not thought of as human in origin or conception. Adam awoke in a garden not of his planting, in a fresh-air suburb of the city of God, and when the descendants of Cain began to build cities on earth, they were building to models already existing in both heaven and hell. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the agencies which helped to raise man from the physical to the human world were such things as the sacraments of religion, the moral law, and the habit of virtue, none of them strictly human inventions. These were the safe and unquestioned agencies, the genuinely educational media. Whether the human arts of poetry and painting and music were genuinely educational in this sense could be and was disputed or denied. And the poets themselves, when they wrote apologies for poetry, seldom claimed equality with religion or law, beyond pointing out that the earliest major poets were prophets and lawgivers. For the modern mind, there are two poles of mental activity. One may be described as sense, by which I mean the recognition of what is presented by experience, the empirical, observant habit of mind in which, among other things, the inductive sciences begin. In this attitude, reality is, first of all, out there, whatever happens to it afterwards. The other pole is the purely formalizing or constructive aspect of the mind, where reality is something brought into being by the act of construction. It is obvious that in pre-Romantic poetry there is a strong affinity with the attitude that we have called sense. The poet, in all ages and cultures, prefers images to abstractions, the sensational to the conceptual. But the pre-Romantic structure of imagery belonged to a nature which was the work of God. The design in nature was, as Sir Thomas Browne calls it, the art of God. Nature is thus an objective structure or system for the poet to follow. The appropriate metaphors of imitation are visual and physical ones, and the creative powers of the poet have models outside him. It is generally recognized that Rousseau represents, and to some extent made, a revolutionary change in the modern attitude. The primary reason for his impact was, I think, not in his political or educational views as such, but in his assumption that civilization was a purely human artifact, something that man had made, could unmake, could subject to his own criticism, and was at all times entirely responsible for. Above all, it was something for which the only known model was in the human mind. This kind of assumption is so penetrating that it affects those who detest Rousseau, or have never heard of him, equally with the small minority of his admirers. Also, it gets into the mind at once, whereas the fading out of such counter-assumptions as the literal and historical nature of the Garden of Eden story is very gradual. The effect of such an assumption is twofold. First, it puts the arts in the center of civilization. The basis of civilization is now the creative power of man. Its model is the human vision revealed in the arts. Second, this model, as well as the sources of creative power, are now located in the mind's internal heaven, the external world being seen as a mirror reflecting and making visible what is within. Thus, the outside world, most of which is up there, yields importance and priority to the inner world. In fact, derives its poetic significance at least from it. In looking at objects of nature, says Coleridge in the notebooks, I seem rather to be seeking, as it were asking for, a symbolical language for something within me that already and forever exists, than observing anything new. This principle extends both to the immediate surrounding world, which is the emblem of the music of humanity in Wordsworth, and to the starry heavens, on which Keats read, huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. Hence, in Romantic poetry, the emphasis is not on what we have called sense, but on the constructive power of the mind, where reality is brought into being by experience. There is a contrast in popular speech between the Romantic and the realist, where the word romantic implies a sentimentalized or rose-colored view of reality. This vulgar sense of the word may throw some light on the intensity with which the Romantic poets sought to defy external reality by creating a uniformity of tone and mood. The establishing of this uniformity, and the careful excluding of anything that would dispel it, is one of the constant and typical features of the best Romantic poetry, though we may call it a dissociation of sensibility if we happen not to like it. Such a poetic technique is psychologically akin to magic, which also aims at bringing spiritual forces into reality through concentration on a certain type of experience. Such words as charm or spell suggest uniformity of mood, as well as a magician's repertoire. Historically and generically, it is akin to romance, with its effort to maintain a self-consistent idealized world without the intrusions of realism or irony. For these reasons, Romanticism is difficult to adapt to the novel, which demands an empirical and observant attitude. Its contribution to prose fiction is rather appropriately enough a form of romance. In the romance, the characters tend to become psychological projections, and the setting a period in a past just remote enough to be recreated rather than empirically studied. We think of Scott as within the Romantic movement, Jane Austen as related to it chiefly by her parodies of the kind of sensibility that tries to live in a self-created world instead of adapting to the one that is there. Marianne in Sense and Sensibility, Catherine in Northanger Abbey, and of course everybody in Love and Friendship are examples. Crabbe's naturalistic manifesto in the opening of The Village expresses an attitude which in itself is not far from Wordsworth's. But Crabbe is a metrical novelist in a way that Wordsworth is not. The soldier in The Prelude and the leech-gatherer in Resolution and Independence are purely romantic characters in the sense just given of psychological projections. That is, they become temporary or epiphanic myths. We should also notice that the internalizing of reality in Romanticism proper develops a contrast between it and a contemporary realism which descends from the pre-Romantic tradition but acquires a more purely empirical attitude to the external world. The third level of the older construct was the physical world, theologically fallen, which man is born into but which is not the real world of human nature. Man's primary attitude to external physical nature is thus one of detachment. The kind of temptation represented by Spencer's Bower of Bliss or Milton's Comus is based on the false suggestion that physical nature, with its relatively innocent moral freedom, can be the model for human nature. The resemblances between the poetic techniques used in the Bower of Bliss episode and some of the techniques of the Romantics are superficial. Spencer, unlike the Romantics, is consciously producing a rhetorical set-piece, designed to show that the Bower of Bliss is not natural, but artificial in the modern sense. Man, for pre-Romantic poets, is not a child of nature in the sense that he was originally a primitive. Milton's Adam becomes a noble savage immediately after his fall, but that is not his original nature. In Romanticism, the cult of the primitive is a byproduct of the internalizing of the creative impulse. The poet has always been supposed to be imitating nature, but if the model of his creative power is in his mind, the nature that he is to imitate is now inside him, even if it is also outside. The original form of human society also is hidden within. Keats refers to this hidden society when he says in a letter to Reynolds, "Man should not dispute or assert, but whisper results to his neighbor, and humanity would become a grand democracy of forest trees." Coleridge refers to it in the Biographia when he says, "The medium by which spirits understand each other is not the surrounding air, but the freedom which they possess in common." Whether the Romantic poet is revolutionary or conservative depends on whether he regards this original society as concealed by or as manifested in existing society. If the former, he will think of true society as a primitive structure of nature and reason, and will admire the popular, simple, or even the barbaric more than the sophisticated. If the latter, he will find his true inner society manifested by a sacramental church or by the instinctive manners of an aristocracy. The search for a visible, ideal society in history leads to a good deal of admiration for the Middle Ages, which on the continent was sometimes regarded as the essential feature of Romanticism. The affinity between the more extreme Romantic conservatism and the subversive revolutionary movements of fascism and Nazism in our day has been often pointed out. The present significance for us of this fact is that the notion of the inwardness of creative power is inherently revolutionary, just as the pre-Romantic construct was inherently conservative, even for poets as revolutionary as Milton. The self-identifying admiration which so many Romantics expressed for Napoleon has much to do with the association of natural force, creative power, and revolutionary outbreak. As Carlyle says, in an uncharacteristically cautious assessment of Napoleon, what Napoleon did will in the long run amount to what he did justly, what nature with her laws will sanction. Further, the Romantic poet is a part of a total process, engaged with and united to a creative power greater than his own because it includes his own. This greater creative power has a relation to him which we may call, adapting a term of Blake's, his vehicular form. The sense of identity with a larger power of creative energy meets us everywhere in Romantic culture. I think even in the crowded, excited canvases of Delacroix and the tremendous will-to-power finales of Beethoven. The symbolism of it in literature has been too thoroughly studied in Professor Abrams's The Mirror and the Lamp, and in Professor Wasserman's The Subtler Language for me to add more than a footnote or two at this point. Sometimes the greater power of this vehicular form is a rushing wind, as in Shelley's Ode, and in the figure of the correspondent breeze studied by Professor Abrams. The image of the Aeolian harp or lyre, Romantic poets are apt to be sketchy in their orchestration, belongs here. Sometimes it is a boat driven by a breeze or current, or by more efficient magical forces in the Ancient Mariner. This image occurs so often in Shelley that it has helped to suggest my title. The introduction to Wordsworth's Peter Bell has a flying boat closely associated with the moon. Those poems of Wordsworth in which we feel driven along by a propelling metrical energy, Peter Bell, The Idiot Boy, The Wagoner, and others, seem to me to be among Wordsworth's most central poems. Sometimes the vehicular form is a heightened state of consciousness in which we feel that we are greater than we know, or an intense feeling of communion, as in the sacramental corn and wine images of the great Keats' odes. The sense of unity with a greater power is surely one of the reasons why so much of the best romantic poetry is mythopoeic. The myth is typically the story of the god, whose form and character are human, but who is also a sun god, or tree god, or ocean god. It identifies the human with the non-human world, an identification which is also one of the major functions of poetry itself. Coleridge makes it a part of the primary as well as the secondary imagination. "This I call I," he says in the notebooks, identifying the percipient and the perceived. The giant forms of Blake's prophecies are states of being and feeling in which we have our own being and feeling. The huge and mighty forms of Wordsworth's Prelude have similar affinities. Even the dreams of De Quincey seem vehicular in the same sense. It is curious that there seems to be so little mythopoeic theory in Romantic poets, considering that the more expendable critics of the time complained as much about the obscurity of myth as their counterparts of today do now. One striking feature of the Romantic poets is their resistance to fragmentation, their compulsion, almost, to express themselves in long, continuous poems is quite as remarkable as their lyrical gifts. I have remarked elsewhere that the romance, in its most naive and primitive form, is an endless sequence of adventures, terminated only by the author's death or disgust. In Romanticism, something of this inherently endless romance form recurs. Childe Harold and Don Juan are Byron to such an extent that the poems about them can be finished only by Byron's death or boredom with the persona. The Prelude, and still more the gigantic scheme of which it formed part, has a similar relation to Wordsworth, and something parallel is beginning to show its head at once in Keats's Sleep and Poetry and Shelley's Queen Mab. We touch here on the problem of the romantic unfinished poem, which has been studied by Professor Bostetter. My present interest, however, is rather in the feature of unlimited continuity, which seems to me connected with the sense of vehicular energy, of being carried along by a greater force, the quality which outside literature, according to Keats, makes a man's life a continual allegory. We have found, then, that the metaphorical structure of Romantic poetry tends to move inside and downward instead of outside and upward. Hence the creative world is deep within, and so is heaven, or the place of the presence of God. Blake's Orc and Shelley's Prometheus are titans imprisoned underneath experience. The gardens of Adonis are down in Endymion, whereas they are up in the Fairy Queen and Comus. In Prometheus Unbound, everything that aids mankind comes from below, associated with volcanoes and fountains. In the Revolt of Islam, there is a curious collision with an older habit of metaphor when Shelley speaks of a power, a thirst, a knowledge, below all thoughts, like light beyond the atmosphere. The Kubla Khan geography of caves and underground streams haunts all of Shelley's language about creative processes. In Speculations on Metaphysics, for instance, he says, "But thought can, with difficulty, visit the intricate and winding chambers which it inhabits. It is like a river whose rapid and perpetual stream flows outwards. The caverns of the mind are obscure and shadowy, or pervaded with a luster, beautifully bright indeed, but shining not beyond their portals." In pre-Romantic poetry, heaven is the order of grace, and grace is normally thought of as descending from above into the soul. In the Romantic construct, there is a center where inward and outward manifestations of a common motion and spirit are unified, where the ego is identified as itself because it is also identified with something which is not itself. In Blake, this world at the deep center is Jerusalem, the city of God that mankind, or Albion, has sought all through history without success because he has been looking in the wrong direction, outside. Jerusalem is also the Garden of Eden, where the Holy Word walked among the ancient trees. Eden in the unfallen world would be the same place as England's green and pleasant land, where Christ also walked. And England's green and pleasant land is also Atlantis, the sunken island kingdom, which we can rediscover by draining the sea of time and space off the top of the mind. In Prometheus Unbound, Atlantis reappears when Prometheus is liberated, and the one great flash of vision, which is all that is left to us of Wordsworth's Recluse, uses the same imagery. Paradise and groves, Elysian fortunate fields, like those of old, sought in the Atlantic main, why should they be a history only of departed things, or a mere fiction of what never was? I, long before the blissful hour arrives, would chant, in lonely peace, the spousal verse of this great consummation. The Atlantis theme is in many other romantic myths, in the Glaucus episode of Endymion, and in De Quincey's Savannah La Mar, which speaks of human life still subsisting in submarine asylums sacred from the storms that torment our upper air. The theme of land reclaimed from the ocean plays also a somewhat curious role in Goethe's Faust. We find the same imagery in later writers who continue the romantic tradition, such as D.H. Lawrence in The Song of a Man Who Has Come Through. If only I am keen and hard like the sheer tip of a wedge, driven by invisible blows, the rock will split. We shall come at the wonder. We shall find the Hesperides. In The Pilgrim's Progress, ignorance is sent to hell from the very gates of heaven. The inference seems to be that only ignorance knows the precise location of both kingdoms. For knowledge, and still more for imagination, the journey within to the Happy Island Garden or the City of Light is a perilous quest, equally likely to terminate in the blasted ruin of Byron's Darkness or Beddoes's Subterranean City. In many romantic poems, including Keats's Nightingale Ode, it is suggested that the final identification of and with reality may be, or at least include, death. The suggestion that death may lead to the highest knowledge, dropped by Lucifer in Byron's Cain, haunts Shelley continually. A famous passage in Prometheus Unbound associates the worlds of creation and death in the same inner area, where Zoroaster meets his image in a garden. Just as the sun is the means but not a tolerable object of sight, so the attempt to turn around and see the source of one's vision may be destructive, as the Lady of Shalott found when she turned away from the mirror. Thus, the world of the deep interior in romantic poetry is morally ambivalent, retaining some of the demonic qualities that the corresponding pre-romantic lowest level had. This sense that the source of genius is beyond good and evil, that the possession of genius may be a curse, that the only real knowledge given to Adam in paradise, however disastrous, came to him from the devil, all this is part of the contribution of Byron to modern sensibility, and part of the irrevocable change that he made in it. Of his Lara, Byron says, "He stood a stranger in this breathing world, an erring spirit from another hurled, a thing of dark imaginings that shaped, by choice the perils he by chance escaped, but scaped in vain, for in their memory yet his mind would half exult and half regret. But haughty still and loath himself to blame, he called on nature's self to share the shame, and charged all faults upon the fleshly form she gave to clog the soul and feast the worm, till he at last confounded good and ill, and half mistook for fate the acts of will." It would be wrong to regard this as Byronic hokum, for the wording is very precise. Lara looks demonic to a nervous and conforming society, as the dragon does to the tame villatic fowl in Milton. But there is a genuinely demonic quality in him which arises from his being nearer than other men to the unity of subjective and objective worlds. To be in such a place might make a poet more creative. It makes other types of superior beings, including Lara, more destructive. We said earlier that a romantic poet's political views would depend partly on whether he saw his inner society as concealed by, or as manifested in, actual society. A romantic poet's moral attitude depends on a similar ambivalence in the conception of nature. Nature to Wordsworth is a mother goddess who teaches the soul serenity and joy, and never betrays the heart that loves her. To the Marquis de Sade, nature is the source of all the perverse pleasures that an earlier age had classified as unnatural. For Wordsworth, the reality of nature is manifested by its reflection of moral values. For de Sade, the reality is concealed by that reflection. It is this ambivalent sense, for it is ambivalent and not simply ambiguous, of appearance as at the same time revealing and concealing reality, as clothes simultaneously reveal and conceal the naked body, that makes Sartor Resartus so central a document of the Romantic movement. We spoke of Wordsworth's nature as a mother goddess, and her psychological descent from mother figures is clearly traced in The Prelude. The corn goddess in Keats's To Autumn, the parallel figure identified with Ruth in the Ode to a Nightingale, the still unravished bride of the Grecian urn, Psyche, even the veiled melancholy, are all emblems of a revealed nature. Elusive nymphs, or teasing and mocking female figures who refuse to take definite form, like the figure in Alastor or Blake's female will types, terrible and sinister white goddesses like La Belle Dame sans merci, or females associated with something forbidden or demonic, like the sister lovers of Byron and Shelley, belong to the concealed aspect. For Wordsworth, who still has a good deal of the pre-Romantic sense of nature as an objective order, nature is a landscape nature, and from it, as in Baudelaire's correspondences, mysterious oracles seep into the mind through eye or ear, even a bird with so predictable a song as the cuckoo being an oracular wandering voice. This landscape is a veil dropped over the naked nature of screaming rabbits and gasping stags, the nature red in tooth and claw, which haunted a later generation. Even the episode of the dog and the hedgehog in the prelude is told from the point of view of the dog, and not of the hedgehog. But the more pessimistic and perhaps more realistic conception of nature, in which it can be a source of evil or suffering, as well as good, is the one that gains ascendancy in the later period of Romanticism, and its later period extends to our own day. The major constructs, which our own culture has inherited from its Romantic ancestry, are also of the drunken boat shape, but represent a later and a different conception of it from the vehicular form described above. Here the boat is usually in the position of Noah's Ark, a fragile container of sensitive and imaginative values threatened by a chaotic and unconscious power below it. In Schopenhauer, the world as idea rides precariously on top of a world as will, which engulfs practically the whole of existence in its moral indifference. In Darwin, who readily combines with Schopenhauer, as the later work of Hardy illustrates, consciousness and morality are accidental sports from a ruthlessly competitive evolutionary force. In Freud, who has noted the resemblance of his mythical structure to Schopenhauer's, the conscious ego struggles to keep afloat on a sea of libidinous impulse. In Kierkegaard, all the higher impulses of fallen man pitch and roll on the surface of a huge and shapeless dread. In some versions of this construct, the antithesis of the symbol of consciousness and the destructive element in which it is immersed can be overcome or transcended. There is an Atlantis under the sea, which becomes an Ararat for the beleaguered boat to rest on. I give an example from Auden, partly because he is prominently featured in this session of the Institute, and partly to show that the Romantic structures of symbolism are still ours. In Freud, when the conscious mind feels threatened by the subconscious, it tries to repress it, and so develops a neurosis. In Marx, the liberal elements in an ascendant class, when they feel threatened by a revolutionary situation, develop a police state. In both cases, the effort is to intensify the antithesis between the two, but this effort is mistaken, and when the barriers are broken down, we reach the balanced mind and the classless society, respectively. For the time being, develops a religious construct out of Kierkegaard on the analogy of those of Marx and Freud. The liberal or rational elements represented by Herod feel threatened by the revival of superstition in the Incarnation and try to repress it. Their failure means that the effort to come to terms with a nature outside the mind, the primary effort of reason, has to be abandoned, and this enables the paradise or divine presence which is locked up inside the human mind to manifest itself after the reason has searched the whole of objective nature in vain to find it. The attitude is that of a relatively orthodox Christianity. The imagery and the structure of symbolism is that of Prometheus unbound and the marriage of heaven and hell. In Romanticism proper, a prominent place in sense experience is given to the ear, an excellent receiver of oracles, but poor in locating things accurately in space. This latter power, which is primarily visual, is associated with the fancy in Wordsworth's 1815 preface, and given the subordinate position appropriate to fancy. In later poetry, beginning with Symbolisme in France, when there is a good deal of reaction against earlier Romanticism, more emphasis is thrown on vision. In Rimbaud, though his Bateau Ivre has given me my title, the poet is to se faire voyant. The illuminations are thought of pictorially. Even the vowels must be visually colored. Such an emphasis has nothing to do with the pre-Romantic sense of an objective structure in nature. On the contrary, the purpose of it is to intensify the Romantic sense of oracular significance into a kind of auto-hypnosis. The association of auto-hypnosis and the visual sense is discussed in Professor Marshall McLuhan's new book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. Such an emphasis leads to a technique of fragmentation. Poe's attack on the long poem is not a romantic but an anti-romantic manifesto, as the direction of its influence indicates. The tradition of symbolisme is present in imagism, where the primacy of visual values is so strongly stated in theory and so cheerfully ignored in practice, in Pound's emphasis on the spatial juxtaposing of metaphor, in Eliot's insistence on the superiority of poets who present the clear visual images of Dante. T.E. Holmes' attack on the Romantic tradition is consistent in preferring fancy to imagination, and in stressing the objectivity of the nature to be imitated, less so in his primitivism and his use of Bergson. The technique of fragmentation is perhaps intended to reach its limit in Pound's publication of the complete poetical works of Holm on a single page. As I have tried to indicate by my reference to Auden, what this anti-romantic movement did not do was to create a third framework of imagery, nor did it return to the older construct, though Eliot, by sticking closely to Dante and by deprecating the importance of the prophetic element in art, gives some illusion of doing so. The charge of subjectivity brought against the Romantics by Arnold, and often repeated later, assumes that objectivity is a higher attribute of poetry, but this is itself a Romantic conception, and came into English criticism with Coleridge. Anti-Romanticism, in short, had no resources for becoming anything more than a post-Romantic movement. The first phase of the reconsideration of Romanticism discussed by this group is to understand its continuity with modern literature, and this phase is now well developed in the work of Professor Kermode and others. All we need do to complete it is to examine Romanticism by its own standards and canons. We should not look for precision where vagueness is wanted, not extol the virtues of constipation when the Romantics were exuberant, not insist on visual values when the poet listens darkling to a nightingale. Then perhaps we may see in Romanticism also the quality that Melville found in Greek architecture, not innovating willfulness, but reverence for the archetype.